Everything can become fascinating when you have all the time of eternity. When does that fascination lead to other things, such as thoughts of one's own lost mortality, morality, and that certain fragile beauty of being a human? It seems we all want things we can't have, whether that be to join the ones you love in this life or the next, to enjoy a moment in history forevermore, to wonder what it's like to grow up, or to even shed the skin of one's own regret. We have far too little time to consider the bigger picture. But for a vampire, this is all they have. This time, this bittersweet remembrance or ignorance of one's own fragility. We marvel vampires as this certain romanticized breed of predators that can be somewhat tamed and loved, or even a monster only thinking about its next meal. But in this adaptation, vampires are us, just with more time on their hands. And what better way to understand the vampire than in Anne Rice's adaptation? This is Two Takes, and this is One Shot, an analysis of Interview with a Vampire. Spoilers are ahead.
Don't be afraid. I'm going to give you the choice I never had.
It's interesting to realise that this type of life, this immortality, might have not been taken winningly. Like a catchphrase, Lestat says this to Louis and then again with the interviewer at the end of the film. A cycle of loss of choices, if one thinks about it. Dreaming of something else might be enough to entice a vampire for your companionship, but the comparison of eternal life versus what you have right now might seem a little steep. To let go of everything you hold dear, even your own humanity. And in this instance, the choice is death or half a life in the shadows. Lestat and Claudia were not given the choice, and in a way, the interviewer Daniel Molloy as well. Louis was given the choice, which is what I find fascinating. The choice of death or immortality. A divide between two extremes. But why choose this? The mystery might lie in the impression we get when Louis first describes his life to the interviewer, describes his wife and child being dead less than half a year and how he longed to join them because he couldn't bear the pain of their loss. And yet, when trying to squander his wealth, his estate, and even his sanity, a vampire answered his calling of something else. And so, when given the choice, Louis chose a darker path instead of the longing of the death he described. It wasn't the act of dying that he longed for, it was the release of what he was going through. Choosing the path of becoming a vampire could potentially take away the suffering of his mortal life and introduce new emotions and sensations. A new identity of sorts. And it does, for a while, until the drinking of blood and where it came from comes into the picture.
God kills indiscriminately, and so shall we. For no creatures under God are as we are, none so like him as ourselves.
A vampire feasting on this particular chosen part of a person, rather than their flesh, might steam deeper into their essence, their soul. It rejuvenates a vampire, much like a meal to a predator, or someone's faith in a divine meaning or idol. Blood and the act of taking it can be seen as something not good or evil, but rather a necessity, as Louis describes it. The characteristics of a vampire in various sources can be described as a kind of blood drunkenness. Referencing this feeling to when Louis takes Claudia's blood when she is still human and his chaotic thoughts of what he has done versus how he feels, shows that the peace he was searching for was indeed in this act of taking. Louis thinks in the way of a moral human, and there is a line that cannot be crossed, wherein, with Lestat being older and more experienced, has decided to embrace the act of taking because the chase, The meal is what gives him what he wants, whether that's peace, like Louis, or something else, perhaps something closer to feeling invincible, much like a god. Lestat does compare himself to a god, a creature that is somewhere closer to God and further away from where it came from, a human. To indiscriminately kill because one can and one will to sustain themselves. It's a cycle of life and death, with the predator being the vampire and the unfortunate prey being a human. This can be said for the slaughtering of cattle or chickens or whatever other animal a human can make a meal out of. It's a natural part of evolution, where the only thing in our place is the vampire, a parasite of sorts, trying to make itself part of the food chain. Definitions of evil and good become warped in the shadows, it seems. In a way, Lestat has his power because he feels closer to something uncanny, not a monster per se, but rather something close to godliness, as he has this power to morph his abilities, to kill or to create, much like God does in the acts of taking or receiving life. And then to go one step further, to give eternal life to a mortal stems this dark ability. Even if the gift was given through Lestat's own loneliness to Louis, a soul all too willing to surrender to the unknown, whether that be death or something darker. And the uncanny won, because it mirrors the known mortal world, but the only difference is oneself, frozen in time, stuck eternally. And if you think about it, the term of a vampire, even though it has evolved throughout the decades, still has its esteemed quality of drinking blood as that gives them life. And so, even though many things change, something can still stay the same. And this can be said for many things, like religion and the teachings of Christ and God. Their teachings, like the Bible, or this impression of this creature of the night, has evolved with us. It's still around, and for the most part, the evil that happens around them, or by their own doing, is explained away. But be aware, this is a theory and a small comparison as to why Lestat might have thought himself godlike at the beginning.
He did it to make you stay with him? Perhaps. He knew me. He knew I would love her more than the waking world. But there was more to it. For he lavished affection on her, there's no doubt about that. Perhaps in the end he did it because he was lonely too.
Claudia, the child feasted upon by one and given life by the other, is the epitome of what it would look like, and perhaps feel like, to be a child and to never grow up. We see all three enjoying themselves in various cities, of Claudia learning the ways of a vampire, however constantly disobeying, with Lestat telling her off with exasperated "never in the house" remark. This quick montage of their equilibrium, of some sort of happiness as this peculiar family, could relate to Peter Pan and the Lost Boys who never grow up. The fun, the games, and the going to bed when you wish is somewhat a fantasy dream of many children. The freedom to do what you want, when you want, with whoever you want. A childlike dream without danger or fear. However, Claudia's childhood quickly fades, as Louis describes how her eyes could only tell how old she is. She grows up, but her body stays the same, and we, the audience, can only sympathize with her as she screams at them to tell her why she does not grow up. Her tale becomes darker, much like Let the Right One In, wherein Claudia is stuck in this preteen age, but with the viewpoint of someone much older and wiser. Her world, which it used to be broad and magnificent, becomes smaller and smaller, the more she tries to venture out. Like a child outside without supervision that always leads to questions. Her death and her creation, even, has consequences on both accounts within the laws of nature. Claudia was made too young, with selfish intent by Lestat to keep Louis as his companion, and then Claudia was killed too young in her vampire form by Armand's orders, through selfish intent, once more wanting Louis to stay as a companion. She never got to grow up in either worlds, with her time stolen forever. What Lestat and Armand could never anticipate was Louis' reactions to their intentions. Louis loved Claudia more than anything, and Armand's enticing comments on learning to leave regret behind has Louis politely declining his invitation to be his companion. To leave regret behind, to leave the pain behind, is what Louis wanted to do at the very beginning, has him wanting to stay. He keeps his humanity because it's all that's left to remember her by, but her death was also his undoing. For someone so willing to love, Louis has had his share of love and loss, and so, with Claudia, his hopelessness has rendered its ugly head. He cannot love anyone else, already suffering too many deaths of his love in his lifetime. And the killing he does do, whether that is for feasting upon to sustain his existence or revenge, Louis shows us that vampires are the representations of death itself. A god, perhaps, in its own right, like Lestat proudly hints at.
That morning I was not yet a vampire, and I saw my last sunrise. I remember it completely, and yet I can't recall any sunrise before it. I watched the whole magnificence of the dawn for the last time as if it were the first. And then I said farewell to sunlight and set out to become what I became.
There can be some form of peace in death for a mortal, a chance to let go of all the pain and suffering that their lives have afforded them with. And for a vampire, for Louis perhaps, there lies the peace in the making of a death to sustain one's own suffering from taking over. The power of blood can change many things, it seems. But there lies the cycle of destruction. Louis, with all his humanity, finds his merciful death to be riddled with guilt. But that might also be the key to Louis maintaining his human morals, sustenance for the vampiric body as well as the human soul. Louis, in so many words, retains his humanity, and that is his beauty, his power. Lestat early in the film expresses his joys of reading the thoughts of those around him, presenting his power to play with the lives and to choose his prey. Claudia, on the other hand, hints at her power, expressing what Armand's soul said to her in the theatre, a quiet but constant let him go towards her companionship with Louis. All in all, the dark gift is different for everyone. Lestat can read thoughts, Claudia can read souls, perhaps desires, and Louis can read emotions, maintaining morality in his immortal shell.
They had forgotten the first lesson, that we must be powerful, beautiful, and without regret.
And you can teach me this?
Yes.
To be without regret?
Yes.
Then what a pair we could make. But what if it's a lesson I don't care to learn?
What do you mean?
What if all I have is my suffering, my regret?
Don't you want to lose it?
So you can have that too. The heart that mourns her that you burnt to a cinder.
Louis, I swear I did.
Ah, but I know you didn't. I know.
You regrets nothing. You feels nothing. If that's all I have left to learn, I can do that on my own.
Everlasting life can perhaps take a burden on one's own soul of sorts. We see Louis struggling with taking life at the beginning, deciding on eating rats and living in a cemetery until Lestat finds him to comfort him. And at the end, we find themselves together again, in an abandoned house, with the roles reversed. Lestat, barely able to move, has Louis following the trail of dead rats and birds to Lestat. The power dynamic has changed, presenting the problem of immortality, that the person can only do so much with it, can only learn so much or go forward in time. Louis moved on and advanced, bringing with him his morals, his regret and grief, moving onwards, Lestat had none of these things to keep him grounded, and therefore has become lost in this new decade, reveling in the bygone era of New Orleans at the beginning of the film. The immortal has become stuck in a lost time, whilst the vampire that maintained his humanity as the edge to keep moving forward. This can be said for Armand, when he too also wanted Louis by his side, but like Lestat, Armand wishes to let go of the things keeping him human, even the aspect of regret. The one thing Louis needs to remain where he is, on the pinnacle of his suffering that had haunted him throughout this film and onwards into the future. It seems these emotions that a vampire heeds as unworthy and unwanted are the only things that keep them from being truly free without consequence. However, there is also this feeling that keeping these emotions that they hinder unnecessary is the one thing that can sustain them as their true selves. A vampire life can be like a new life, a new identity like I had said before, but a new identity in life does not mean a rejection of who you are, a rejection of what you've been through. Without the regret and grief and suffering that Louis carries throughout the film, at the beginning for his dead wife and child, and then later on for Claudia, Louis becomes lost in his suffering, warning others of the destruction of being a vampire. A destruction of life and blood, but also a destruction of one's own identity, their essence, their soul. A destruction of never really knowing why a vampire exists, much like humans questioning the meaning of their lives on a daily basis. It might be an exchange, thinking about it, the giving and the taking. When a vampire takes the essence of a mortal, the vampire has their mortal identity stripped from them, ever so slowly, with Louis becoming this being in the middle, perfectly balanced within this world of suffering and torment. And from the beginning to the ending of this film, Louis has not changed in the slightest. Everything moves at lightning speed, with Louis only idly watching the world go by within his new identity, with his old wounds still making him bleed like a mortal.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed what was said, then please support the show from my Patreon. And if you want to know what's happening next, follow my Instagram. To know my day-to-day thoughts, follow my Twitter. And if you want to read what was said instead, then follow my blog, linked elsewhere. With your support, I can only make this better, so again, thank you from the bottom of my heart.